About a week had passed, and it was the last day of the experiment. They just had one more thing to do. Mrs. Alexander gave Brian a quick change. As Brian lay there under the tabs, Mrs. Alexander began to speak. "Why do I still need these things?" Brian exclaimed. "Well, you haven't used a toilet in a week, so you might be a little rusty," she giggled. "I don't know what to think. Also, honey, we've got one last thing to do before the experiment is over," she said as she taped up Brian's tabs and put his suspenders on. "But what is it?" Brian asked, curious yet apprehensive. "I can't tell you. It's a surprise. But we've got to go outside right away," Mrs. Alexander replied. Together, they walked outside to a small van parked in Mrs. Alexander's driveway, its windows tinted. She asked Brian, "If you could get in?" "If I have to," Brian said reluctantly. Mrs. Alexander buckled him into the van. He could not see the driver or outside because of the tinted windows. "Why are the windows tinted?" Brian inquired. Mrs. Alexander responded, "You'll know why later, honey, but we can't tell you right now." They drove for what seemed like an hour. The driver stopped to get gas. Mrs. Alexander asked Brian if he needed to change. "Yes, what do you think? It's been like forever," Brian replied. Mrs. Alexander agreed. "Yeah, we don't want you to get too stinky in here." She pulled out a diaper and changing supplies, then got the key to go to the gas station bathroom. After promptly changing Brian, she looked down at him and asked, "Are you hungry or thirsty?" "A little thirsty," Brian replied groggily. "Okay," she said and handed him a grape juice sippy cup, which he grabbed with both hands like a toddler. He drank it in a matter of seconds. "Somebody was thirsty, weren't they?" Mrs. Alexander remarked. "Yep," Brian replied. Another hour passed, and they finally arrived at their destination, the New Jersey Convention Center and Auditorium. They entered through the back door, walking down a long hallway. As they walked, Brian murmured, oh no, a stinky. I mean an accident." He looked up, puzzled. "What the hell did I just say?" he whispered to himself. Mrs. Alexander reassured him. "It's okay. I'm going to have to change you anyway." They eventually reached the end of the hallway. Mrs. Alexander locked the door behind them. She began to hang up some of her clothes and warm up the locker areas. It was a pretty nice locker room with carpeted floors. "Brian, go take a shower. You're very stinky. I think you need more than just a changing," she instructed. Brian, feeling overwhelmed, took a shower as instructed. After the shower, Mrs. Alexander toweled him down thoroughly, gave him a full exam, and then dressed him in a very fancy and elegant velvet cloth diaper with some disposable padding inside. She brushed Brian's teeth and hair, cleaned him up, shaved all the hair off his body, and sprayed him with baby powder cologne. "Can you please try not to have any accidents for a little bit? Can you do that, honey?" Mrs. Alexander asked. "Yeah, I'll try," Brian replied obediently. "There's one more thing. I upped your medication," she said as she put 2 pills in his hand. Brian promptly took them. Then she got some flip-flops for him to put on. They both sat there waiting. Then there was a knock at the door of the locker room's last changing area. Mrs. Alexander placed a number sign on Brian, 116, and they walked down another hallway, not quite as long, eventually entering a large room. This room was filled with young men from 18 to 24, all having a baby-faced look and wearing different types of fancy cloth diapers. Brian was upset and didn't understand what was happening. He tried to speak, but then he heard an announcer first call out numbers and names. Marcus, 108, Sam, 111, Malcolm, 117, and eventually, Brian, 118. A man in a black golf shirt and pants led Brian to the stage. Before walking out, the man asked him to remove his flip-flops. Brian looked into the crowd and saw a sea of women, ranging from 45 to about 65 career women. "Oh, what the hell," he thought to himself, unable to speak, reeking of baby powder cologne. Denise stood on a small, circle-shaped pedestal that rotated. "Baby Brian, he's 22, comes from the University of New Jersey, he's 5, 9 inches tall, weighs 145 pounds, and is being regressed to the mindset of an infant," the announcer declared. "Let's start the bid at $1,000. Bids quickly escalated. $2,300, $5,000. Going once, going twice. Sold. You have adopted baby Brian, the announcer proclaimed. Two large men grabbed Brian by each arm and escorted him down the stairs to another room. Don't get up, a technician told him, though Brian was too groggy and out of it from the medication Mrs. Alexander had given him to think of such a thing. A woman around 50 walked into the room. So this is my new little man, she exclaimed loudly. A man, presumably to escort Brian, added, You've got to go with her now. Brian did not say anything. The man spoke again, more loudly. You must go with her now. Compliantly, Brian got up and followed the woman. Usually Brian wasn't so cooperative, but he couldn't understand what was getting into him. They walked down a very quiet set of stairs to a very nice town car. Brian and the woman got in the back, and she began to speak. I can't believe I got my bargain for only $5,000, she said to someone on the phone. Turning to Brian, she added, I'm going to take very good care of you. End of the story.